he obtained a PhD in 1988 with his thesis that was awarded with the extraordinary prize of the Polytechnic University of Madrid. He is now director of the publication of the Juan de Herrera Institute. He is co-founder and president since 2003 of the Spanish Society for Construction History. And he is also co-founder since the 2018 of the Summer School on Historic Masonry Structures. Among the well-known publications, his book published in 2004 with the title Arcos, Bóvedas y Cúpulas, Arch, Vaults and Domes. And in 2010, he published the paper, The Safety of Masonry Buttresses, that was awarded with the Telford Medal in 2011 by Institution of Civil Engineers in London. He has been consultant for numerous historical buildings, such as the cathedrals of Palma de Mallorca and Santiago de Compostela. And he's probably one of the greatest experts in the world in structural theory and construction history of vaulted architecture. And I would also add that why did we ask Professor Huerta to deliver this conference within the Arco program? The program, as you know, is Storia, Costruzione e Restauro, la cultura storica e tecnica degli architetti e degli ingegneri. We asked Professor Huerta to deliver this conference because we believe that construction history is a key aspect in the culture of architects and engineers, which is fundamental in the process of understanding the structural behavior of a monument, also to prevent the use of improper retrofitting measures. So thank you very much, Santiago, for accepting, and we are very happy to hear your conference. Thank you.
I thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to me to participate in this series. So thank you to Arco and also to you, Marco. Historic buildings have survived for centuries or millennia, and this is an indisputable proof that they are well designed and built. These buildings are robust, and they were maintained with the same materials and methods along history until the 20th century. They have cracked and deformed, and they have withstood earthquakes, fires, and wars. So that these buildings are extremely robust is a historical fact. However, today, at the beginning of the 21st century, we view these buildings, these historic buildings, particularly masonry buildings, with great mistrust. Masonry architecture forms a major part of the built heritage, and we should investigate the reasons for this mistrust, which contradicts squarely the historical facts. In my opinion, the reason is the complete loss of the masonry building tradition based on the use of the arch and the vault, which started in the 19th century and which culminated in the collapse of the whole tradition in the second half of the 20th century. The nature of masonry, an orderly stacking of stones or bricks, which is essentially discontinuous and heterogeneous, which does not resist tension, which cracks and deforms in a way that we do not understand now, and which seems therefore dangerous to us, and that contradicts the framework of ideas associated with the modern reinforced concrete and steel structures. Masonry construction seems strange and alien to us. We are ignorant, we do not understand or appreciate the essential robustness of this marvelous construction. Ignorance breeds fear. Fear clouds judgment and leads to wrong decisions. Moreover, fear often leads to an aggressive, defensive so to say, defensive reaction. Many interventions that are carried out today, often with the best of intentions, actually turn against the monument itself. In reality, the modern architect or engineer, unconsciously, wishes that the historic structures were made of reinforced concrete or steel, or perhaps now of carbon fiber. The modern architect or engineer would like to prevent the natural cracking and movement of the masonry, to turn the pile of stones into a monolith. Modern interventions seek in vain this transformation, and historic construction see their essential nature violated by massive interventions of reinforced concrete, steel, carbon fiber, resins, etc. I repeat, there is an unconscious desire to transform the masonry, which is the fruit of our prejudice. The prejudice is something which is not questioned. It is in our minds. And this prejudice is that masonry is bad. Masonry is dangerous. But as we have seen, this prejudice arises from our ignorance. You cannot understand and preserve what you do not understand. You cannot understand and respect what you fear. And in the last years, many times we have seen that suddenly very old structures, some 2 millennia old, like the aqueduct of Segovia, are suddenly collapsing. Maybe the problem is in the head of the architects or engineers and not in the monuments. We see all too often the consequences of this vicious circle of ignorance and fear, which leads to an aggressive response. Then there is greed for profit and money. Aggressive interventions, besides damaging the monuments, are very expensive and lead to great profits for all those who participate in them. This cocktail of ignorance, fear, and greed is destroying our monuments, turning them into a sort of Frankenstein's monster. One wonders what will be left of them in 100 years. Will there be any buildings that have been spared these strange aggressions that violate their very nature? The only way to reverse, or at least to stop this process is knowledge. Knowledge eliminates fear, or at least keeps it within tolerable limits. Indeed, it is said that courage is knowing how to control the fear, and not to make some interventions require courage. Knowledge also has the positive effect of increasing our respect and allowing objective judgments. The survival over centuries or millennia of this construction is, I repeat, an irrefutable proof of the robustness. Fortunately, we have now a rigorous and adequate theoretical framework for structural behavior, a modern limit analysis developed by Professor Jacques Heyman of Cambridge since the 1960s. This theoretical framework explains the enormous stability of historical masonry, the capacity to resist the aggressions of the environment. And the touchstone of a good theory is that it explains the facts. But how can we analyze, for example, a great Gothic church if we do not know how it was planned, how it was built, what geometrical rules were used in its design, how its walls were erected, how the stones were chosen and the mortars fabricated, how it is founded, etc. You cannot analyze a historical construction without knowing the history of the construction. Architectural history books abound, but they say little, if anything, about how buildings were constructed. The history of building technology is, in my opinion, essential to complete our vision of historical architecture, and essential to be able to make progress in recovering the knowledge lost in the course along the 20th century. In what follows, I will very briefly explain the origin of this discipline of construction history and its current state. Since the beginning of architecture, in every time there was an interest in knowing the methods of construction of previous builders. Vitruvius is based on previous Greek manuals. Brunelleschi, before building his great dome, studied with great detail with his friend Donatello the Roman ruins in Rome. Alberti also gathers a lot of the medieval tradition which was compiled before him. One of the first to make what we say more or less right drawings of the Roman concrete was Rusconi, who explained for the first time the stratified nature of the Roman concrete. Piranesi, both of them, father and son, tried to explain in some of their drawings the internal structure of the monuments. Sometimes they invented things. For example, they invented the arches inside the dome of the Pantheon, which we know now that they don't exist. Terenzio in the 1930s proved that. Also, it is fanciful, this structure of the foundations of this Roman bridge. But at least Piranesi tried to imagine or to understand what were the structure of these monuments. Fischer von Erlach, at the end of the 18th century, in what is considered the first book on the history of architecture, made drawings in which we see the same attempt to imagine the internal construction of the monuments. It is along the 19th century where all this tradition is compiled in different manuals, which now constitute an authentic treasure to study the ancient or the old traditions of vaulting. First, Rondelet, 1802, Traité théorique pratique de l'art de bâtir. It is also one of the first books which contains whole chapters on the history of construction. Robert Willis, in 1842, it is 42, not 43, made the first scientific and rigorous study of the geometry of the vaults of the Middle Ages. Viollet-le-Duc dedicated all his life to the study of the medieval construction with a zeal and intelligence which is difficult to imagine. In Germany, not so well known, Ungewitter wrote also a manual, a handbook of Gothic construction with a detailed description of all Gothic construction in the German area. And it is noteworthy also the additions made by Karl Mormann, professor in Hanover, who in the third edition of Ungewitter's manual include almost 200 pages on statistical analysis of the Gothic structure, which constitute, from my point of view, still today the best study of this of the equilibrium of Gothic structures. And also, it is necessary to mention Choisy, L'Art de Bâtir, chez les Romains, the Byzantine, the Egyptians, and Durm, Joseph Durm, Die Baukunst der Griechen, Die Baukunst der Etrusker, construction in Greece and Rome. Here are the plates, one of the plates of Rondelet, showing, for example, the structure of the dome in Ravenna, or repeating the mistake of Piranesi, showing these internal ribs in the dome of the Pantheon, which do not exist. the Temple of Minerva Medica, etc. In this plate also shows the use of iron in the Greek and Roman temples to join the stone blocks so that they wouldn't slide, probably during the earthquakes. As I said, it was Robert Willis. Robert Willis, who was an engineer, a scientist, and the best architectural historian in England in the 19th century. It is worth reading today, more than reading, studying, because it is quite difficult to follow the arguments of Robert Willis with all his analytical drawings full of letters and signs, etc. And then, of course, Viollet-le-Duc, the more famous of all the construction historians in the 19th century, with his wonderful analytical drawings. Choisy was the first in 1873 who stated clearly his objective. His objective was to explain the internal structure of the Roman constructions. And the ideas of Choisy are now common knowledge. Choisy is no longer quoted by archaeologists because the ideas of Choisy has been incorporated in our common knowledge about Roman construction. And Choisy also studied the Byzantine construction with combination of walls built without centering. Joseph Durm, a Bavarian architect who was interested in the classicist approach. He traveled to Greece and Rome and made these analytical drawings, which explain much better than any photograph the foundings and the interpretation of the foundings. Here is the plates, a selection of the illustration on Roman construction. Again, it appears again the Piranesi invention, no? The comparison, for example, between Gothic cathedrals and Roman buildings. All these books, which are now almost completely forgotten, deserve a rereading. Durm also explained the structure with these wonderful drawings of Santa Maria del Fiore, St. Peter's, the Baptisterium in Cremona, in Florence, etc. As I said, in the third edition of Ungewitter Handbook of Gothic Architecture, he added almost 200 pages of the third volume to the study of the equilibrium of Gothic structures. And within the frame of modern limit analysis, we know that this approach of equilibrium is completely correct. We know that this tradition was disappearing during the 20th century, particularly after the First World War. But the traditions don't want to die so easily, particularly the old professors don't want to die, and they want to teach the same things they were teaching maybe 20 or 30 years before. We have a document in the School of Architecture, which is the notebook of Luis Moya, a notable architect, and he was a student, and this notebook has been preserved, and we found in this book the drawings he copied from the blackboard by his professor Carlos Gatto. And here we can identify almost every single drawing from Durm, from Viollet, from Choisy, etc. After the Spanish Civil War, in 1947, a young architect, Fernández Huidobro, obtained the chair of construction, and the notes for his lectures has been preserved, and his notes of 1947, we see again the same drawings of the tradition of vaulting structures. Of course, in the Spain of Franco, this kind of vaulted constructions were considered by the regime more nice or more adequate than the modern architecture. The same professor, Fernández Huidobro, in the 1970s, renovated his lectures, and he maintained the teaching of the construction of vaultings after the models of Choisy and Violet, but he incorporated also the new structures, membranes, shells, etc. So along the 20th century, in spite of the predominance, the absolute dominion of the new materials, reinforced concrete and steel, and the new structural types, frames, beams, this interest on the history of construction is maintained. For example, in the book on the history of technology, there is always a chapter on building construction, on building history. In the 1920s, some architects published booklets, for example, on the medieval builder and his methods, 1920, or some archaeologists indeed made particular researches on particular elements, dependencies and squinches in Islamic architecture. In 1934, Paul Abram, a remarkable architect of the modern architecture in France, presented in 1934 a dissertation in Paris about the rationalism of Viollet-le-Duc. This dissertation was a frontal attack to the theories of Viollet-le-Duc. But what is interesting in this context, and the context of this lecture, is that still in the 1930s there was an interest about the medieval theories. But this interest was now not from the part of architects who wanted to build this kind of structures like in the 19th century, but from the point of view of the curious researcher. This book in 1934, which is still in print, is an amazing work on building in England, based on the study of the documents. 1939, an engineer, an American engineer, William Barclay Parsons, published this Engineers and Engineers in the Renaissance, and he contributed many in many aspects of the history of construction. In Germany, during the war, well, not in Germany, Friedrich Hess was professor in Switzerland, in the ETH. For example, Friedrich Hess was one of the not few architects who considered that it was better to maintain the traditions and to forget Le Corbusier and Bauhaus, etc., and publish this book, Construction und Form im Bauen, Construction and Form in Building, which, by the way, was translated and published in Spanish also a few years later. Then he published a second book on the building of vaults, and the second book had the intention of encouraging the students to build vaulting models, so to maintain in some way the tradition of vaulting. 1948, this was absolutely out of the fashion. The same in Pays-Bas. Goethals published a book on arches, walls, and domes. And he studied not only the medieval or the Renaissance or Roman walls, but also the modern constructions which were built, the modern shells built by Dischinger, thin shells in Germany, or the modern designs, but with domes, built in the 1930s in the Netherlands. Tunisen published in 1950 a book he wrote during the Second World War. he was a famous Dutch architect. He refused to sign a manifesto in favor of the Nazis who has occupied Netherlands. And so he was forbidden to work as an architect. So he dedicated the years of the war to write this book, which is a fabulous, stupendous compilation of all the previous manuals. Here we can distinguish again the drawings of Violet. For example, this drawing on the upper left part is taken from Violet. This other of the centering are taken from Ungewitter, etc. And in the book, he included some photographs of the buildings he has built using vaults. So Tunisian followed the wrong way, so to say, of maintaining the use of domes and arches in the new buildings. In the same way, in Spain in 1947, the time of the autarky, when Spain was isolated from the rest of Europe, and it was completely destroyed. Well, not completely, but with a great amount of destruction after the Civil War. This voltafoglio tile vault was recovered and reused in the rebuilding of many buildings, in restoration, but also in the rebuilding of whole villages. And Luis Moya Blanco, the same young student who was copying these drawings of Choisy in the 1920s, now he was an important architect with very good relationship with the government of Franco, and he built wonderful buildings with vaults. For example, the dome of the Universidad Laboral de Gijón has an oval dome with a span, the great axis is almost 40 meters. So, and he published this book, The Construction of Tile Vaults or Voltafoglio. At the same time, in England, this book was published, and if it was published, it was because the editors thought that maybe someone would like to buy the book. Cathedrals and how they were built, very elementary, again copying drawings of the previous century. 1949, Hans Traub, a German engineer. This is another war book. He confessed in the foreword that he was working in the book during the impasse of the war. The book was published very shortly in English, A History of Civil Engineering, and it is still one of the best handbooks for students or non-students who are interested in an overview of the history of building construction. In 1953, Timoshenko, a Russian professor who fled from the revolution and established eventually in the United States and produced a series of manuals who are in the basis of the teaching of structural theory even today, published this book, History of Strength of Materials, which is much more than that. It is a history of structural theory. Archaeologists continue to study and to publish books with an interest on construction, trying to not only to register, but to understand and interpret the findings. This book, in 2 volumes by the Greek Orlandos, is published first in Greek and after in French. It is still today a wonderful book to prepare a lecture, for example, on Greek construction. And the same of this Martin, Manuel d'Architecture Grec, published a few years later. Also, it is an excellent handbook for understanding Greek construction. In Italy, there were also many books published. Maybe one of the most important is this by Lugli, La Tecnica Edilizia Romana, 2 volumes, a massive work explaining the construction of Roman buildings. And we can recognize here again the drawings by Choisy and Durm, no? this is curious because here in this figure he put after Durm, but it is after Durm after Choisy. Durm copy Choisy, and now gladly reproduce Durm, maybe without knowing that Choisy made before this drawing. The interest in medieval vaulting and the construction of vaults and the geometry also it was maintained. No? It is interesting in Germany. There were some publications which were financed by the building companies, and this is the case of this journal, Heracliff Rundschau, which was published by this company of materials of construction. And we see that in the 1950s, some of the booklets they published included many topics of construction history. For example, this first elevator. And another German published a thick book on the compiling all the drawings made about the construction of the Tower of Babel. The same time, 1950s, 1960s, in Germany, there was this book, The Perfect Architect, Builder and the Organization of Building in the Middle Ages. A History of Building Materials in 1961. And this book, which is still in print, John Fitchen, The Construction of Gothic Cathedrals. An important book with maybe some hypotheses which are not sustained sufficiently, but in any case, a wonderful book. Maybe Fitchen was the last one who studied Viollet-le-Duc. So it's full of reference to Violet, etc. It is for anyone who wants to go in depth in the building of Gothic. This is a must. You must have the Fitchen and at least to read it in part. This is a recent discovery. In the 1960s, 1962. A group of professors in the Faculty of Architecture in St. Petersburg published a book on construction history, a book which is extremely interesting because includes some parts of the history of construction, particularly after the Russian Revolution, which are almost completely unknown to Western scholars. Another tradition in Germany is that the building companies publish books for gifts, for Christmas gifts, and then they pay a professor or a scholar some money, and then this professor writes a book, and this book is sent as a present for Christmas. And for example, this is one of these books. Erwin Rupp wrote a series of these books, which shows the interest in Germany in the 1960s about the history of construction. This is a book about the transportation of big loads, and it's a wonderful book. The same author wrote this book, Building Construction in Antiquity. And also in the 60s, Franz Hart published this book, The Art and Technique of Vaulting, which is also a gift book. Not only the history of masonry, but also in the 1960s, one of the first books on the history of reinforced concrete and pre-stressed concrete. So this book by Hagerman and Uberti is again a must for anyone who is interested in the history of early applications of reinforced concrete. In Netherlands, also the most complete compilation of medieval illustrations on buildings was made by this woman, Frida van Tiegen, in 1966. It is in Dutch, unfortunately, but the second volume is of plates, and there is the best compilation of plates on the extracted from codex, Bibles, etc. And in the 1960s, Henry Cowan, a Jew who fled from Europe. His original name was Cohen. He changed the name during the Second World War to Cowan, because he fought against the Nazis. In case he was captured by the Nazis, they compelled the Jews to change their names. Cowan emigrated to Australia. In Australia, he founded the first department on architectural science. And in Australia, he was very active and, for example, published a series, well, it is not here still, published a series of books. This is the first of the books on the history of what he calls architectural science. It is the technical part of the practice of architecture. Then, at the end of the 1960s, another book about the history of engineering, compilating different contents and illustration taken from the traditional manuals of Belidor, manuals of the 18th or 19th century, which now are in internet. But then it was very difficult to have access to this information. In France, Jean-Baptiste H. published Éléments d'une histoire de l'art de bâtir, which is more about the history of architecture than the history of construction, but in any case, the selection of the title is marking this tendency, this new interest on construction history. Ackland, published in Canada, in Toronto, again, a very good book on Gothic construction, which should be consulted by anyone who has an interest on this topic. And in 1972, Professor Heyman published his essay on Coulomb's memoir on statics, which goes much farther than the simple publication and translation of the memoirs by Coulomb. Again, in Germany, we found visiting the cathedrals or the monuments, this kind of booklets dedicated to construction history, and these booklets were published with the intention to be sold. So there was an interest in arches and walls and masonry. A first congress on the construction in the Middle Ages was held with very few participants in 1973 in France, and some dissertations in Germany were dedicated to particular aspects of the technique of construction. For example, this wonderful dissertation on the carpentries, the wooden trusses in the roofs of Baroque churches. In 1976, the American Concrete Association published a selection of historic papers in concrete. Again, at this time, it was a very good initiative. It was not so easy to gather all this information. And Henry Cowan, after 10 years or 12 years in Australia, published these two books, The Master Builders and the Science and Building, Master Builders until the 19th century, and Science and Building, Construction in the 19th century. And these two books are also a very good reference to prepare a lecture on construction history. Some others were interested. I will cite briefly a few. Tom Peters in ETH published a book on transitions in engineering, and then he went to United States and published this book, Building in the 19th Century, which is again a very good book. The production of dissertations continue, concentrated on particular aspects. For example, these books by Jan Feika, Arches and Barrel Vaults in Islamic Architecture, is a wonderful compilation on a topic which is mostly unknown. We know very much about Roman vaulting or Gothic vaulting, but we know almost nothing about Islamic vaulting. in the Deutsches Museum, they published this book, Am Anfang war der Balken. At the beginning, there were the beams, and it is another book, a popular book on construction history. Another German, the technification of building, 1980, or another dissertation published as a book, a study of fan vaulting, a study of form, technology, and meaning in the 1980. In Italy, of course, we must cite Edoardo Benvenuto, who made an enormous task in promoting the history, in particular of the theory of structures, but also of construction. La Ciencia della Costruzione is a classic book. And the first colloquium on the history of structures was held in Cambridge in 1982, organized by Jacques Heyman. And we have a look at the list of people participating. We found here Tom Peters, Sutherland, Bill Addis, Mainstone, Collins, G.R. Collins, Radok, Charlton, Schleich, the German engineer, etc. Bill Addis published some books on the history of structural engineering, and this handbook, this massive book, Building 3,000 Years of Design, Engineering and Construction, which is, I think, the last handbook which has been published considering the whole history of construction history. Again, it is a must for anyone wanting to deliver a course on construction history. Archaeologists continue to publish books on the Bau technique, that is the technique of building in ancient times. And in the 1980s, 1983, 1984, the first Society of Construction History was established in England, the UK Construction History Society, which began to publish a yearly volume on construction history, which is now the main international journal of construction history is still published. In Germany, they continue to publish these books of not so much scholarly books, but of popular books, but written by very good specialists. This book by Lamprecht has studied in detail the Roman building technology, particularly in Germany, and made strength tests, etc. Even he built Roman cranes to test the possible functioning of these machines described by Vitruvius in great detail. Also, in the mid-1980s, within the team of Fray Otto in Stuttgart, in his Institute of Light Structures, some of his disciples, in particular Rainer Greffe, asked for a research project on history of construction, and they published a series of, they organized symposia and published the corresponding proceedings in booklet format. Independently, Fritz Wenzel published also this series of conservation of historic buildings, which contains many papers on construction history. It was not only dealing with practical matters, but contained many papers on construction history. In the same 1980s, something was happening in the 1980s. Something, a new awareness about the necessity, maybe unconscious, about the feeling that we should go back or to study the old traditions of building. In Netherlands, Maeschke published a wonderful book on the Gothic building tradition, unfortunately in Dutch, but the drawings can be understood. Miron Mislin, professor in Berlin, wrote a handbook trying to follow the same path of Straub, the history of building construction, on building technique, and again, independently, on the history of building technology, a series of articles compiled in 2 volumes in 1990. Sebastian Storz, an archaeologist who was excavating in Cartago. He was interested in the construction of vaults with hollow tubes, tubi fitili, and he went so far as to fabricate the tubes and construct new vaults just to understand how was the process of building with this technique, which is ceramic tubes and gyps. And these vaults, as it is seen in the photographs, are built without centering. In Madrid in 1996, a group of architects and engineers, we decided that it was maybe the time to organize a national congress to see if there was an interest or not in the discipline. The congress was a complete success. It was a surprise. And this was the first of a series of congresses in Spain on construction history. One congress every 2 years, and the last 3 international with participation of American scholars. The first international congress on construction history was organized in 2003, also in Madrid. And now there is an international congress on construction history every 3 years. This year was the 7th in Lisbon, unfortunately by Zoom, because it was impossible to go there. But in 3 years, in 2024, we hope we could meet all in Zurich, and Stefan Holzer will be the organizer of the 8th International Congress. There have been at the beginning of this century, in the decade of the first decade of this 21st century, there have been a number of international congresses. For example, the Luso Brasileiro, Brazil-Portugal, 2 international congresses, and also there were conferences organized by the different societies. There is the Construction History Society in UK, was the first found in 1980. In 1997 was found the Spanish Society. In 2004 was found the French Society, and in 2008 the German Society, and they all organized congresses and published the proceedings in book form. There are also some publishers who have series dedicated to construction history. We began in the Instituto Juan de Herrera in Madrid in 1995 to publish a series of books on the theory and history of constructions, and we have published so far, I don't know how many, something like 21 or 22 books. Gargiani in Swiss initiated a new history of construction, which he has published only 2 books by now. But for example, recently, Bill Heuser began a new series on cultural and technical values of historical buildings, which is essentially construction history, and there has been 3 volumes has been published. And Ernst & Son have initiated also in 2018 a new series on construction history with the specific title of construction history. And the first book is by Karl Eudencurrer, The History of the Theory of Structures, which is, again, a must, the best compilation for anyone interested in the history of the theory of structures. Then Viladis has published a massive book on 45 contribution on the employment of physical models along history. Stefan Holzer has, less than 1 year ago, published a book on the centering. This is a very well-unknown topic, and Werner Lorenz and Fedorov and others are going to publish in the next few months 2 massive volumes on the iron structures in the Hermitage in is St. Petersburg, no? So, in conclusion, coming back to the beginning, we cannot break this vicious circle of ignorance, fear, and greed, and the corresponding prejudice against masonry constructions without recovering the knowledge, theoretical and practical, associated to this building tradition. And in this process of recovering, the discipline of construction history, which I have tried to show that it is an old and new discipline, which is now in a state of how do you say, of blossoming or growing in the last 2 decades. Construction history is fundamental. However, construction history is not only an auxiliary, for example, for the people working in restoration. It is a discipline in its own right, as it serves to explain and understand one of the oldest human activities, which is that of building construction. The attention that awakens this field, the growing number of publications demonstrated in the Congress, the new chairs, some new chairs has been created in the last 10 years, 20 years on construction history in Germany, in Netherlands, in Swiss. This makes the future of the discipline promising, but this future will come to fruition if we work with full awareness of the dangers and difficulties of building a new discipline. The first task will be to achieve a full university status. Construction history, in my opinion, should be taught as core syllabus in the graduate courses of the schools of architecture and engineering, maybe also in archaeology and historical studies, in the same way as architectural history is taught now. Construction history do not compete with architectural history or archaeology or medieval studies. It complements. It is another point of view. Then we will need for these courses new full-time teachers on construction history, researchers, departments, etc., which we do not have now. The second task is to form the apparatus of bibliographies, critical editions, detailed studies, handbooks, reference guides, which would allow to place the different subjects in the context of the discipline. This work will improve our understanding and especially eliminate errors and avoid repetitions. And finally, still a considerable work of original research within this field of construction history is needed. It is quite a hard work, as mentioned. As we have seen, the information is dispersed in many books, some old, some new. We can find the pertinent papers in journals of architecture, engineering, medieval studies, Byzantine studies, archaeology, Roman, etc., etc. It is difficult to orientate in this now not well organized discipline. This is normal. We are breaking new ground, and there is much scope to explore and discover. But the difficulties now of an emerging discipline are almost insurmountable when the so-called quality agencies of research, unfortunately exist in every country, I am afraid, arbitrarily require an immediate impact of the publish. How could possibly authentic new original research have an immediate impact? Where are the journals of a truly new discipline? And the books? How are these publications classified and what are the keywords? This task, the task of building the discipline of construction history, will be hard and long. We will need probably a generation, maybe two. In fact, it took 2 generations to establish the discipline now well diffused of history of science. George Sarton, mainly, another, Sarton is the founder of the journal ISIS, began to work in the 1910s, but he succeeded to convert this discipline in a worldwide discipline only in the 1950s, also 2 generations. But if the thing is difficult, I may quote Spinoza, all noble things are as difficult as they are rare. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Santiago, for this very nice and beautiful conference. Thank you for sharing with us this wonderful review of treatise of the 20th century, and the passion and the competence that you transmitted us lead me back to the time when I was a student and I was following Antonino Giuffre lectures on statics. And at that time, it was about in half of the 1980. And at that time, it was nice because he was starting discovering and studying the treatise on construction. And I completely agree with you that we really need to have more rooms for this discipline in research, in journals, because really there is not enough room in journals. And most of these, we have to go back teaching these disciplines in our school, because, for instance, in the School of Engineering, we are less interested on how to build and more interested on how to calculate, but especially for historic buildings, how to build is much more important than how to calculate the buildings. So I completely believe with you that this is a very important and strategic discipline in our field, in the field of architecture and engineering. So thank you very much. And I would like to ask people that are attending this seminar if there is any question, anche in italiano, se c'è qualcuno che vuole fare delle domande al professor Huerta. Il professor Huerta capisce benissimo l'italiano, quindi potete farle direttamente e quindi prego.
Allora, se c'è questo silenzio, io mi lancio.
Brava Elisabetta.
No, perché speravo di non dover dire nulla, perché va bene, è stata una conferenza veramente bellissima. Per quanto mi riguarda, una sequenza bibliografica come quella che ci è stata offerta da Huerta, cioè spazza via ogni facile periodizzazione di questa disciplina, no? Io immaginavo che ci fosse stato, diciamo, nel corso del Novecento un vuoto, perché vedevo soltanto dalla parte italiana. E quindi invece mi rendo conto che per quanto carsico, cioè non organizzato in una disciplina organizzata ovviamente ha bisogno di congressi, di giornali, di iniziative, ma per quanto non organizzato, quello che ci ha fatto vedere Sebastian Huerta è una continuità di questi studi. Non c'è stato nessun momento di interruzione in realtà, semplicemente quella sequenza che non ha momenti di interruzione, perché lui è andato proprio diretto, io mi sono appuntata tutte le date, non ci sono vuoti, e quando invece noi in modo ignorante avevamo la sensazione che in corrispondenza con la periodizzazione del movimento moderno questi studi fossero stati abbandonati, e quello che lui ci ha insegnato è che non è così. semplicemente non erano organizzati, e quello che lui ha detto alla fine è che ancora hanno bisogno di organizzazione, nonostante le straordinarie iniziative dei congressi nazionali e internazionali, perché lo scopo, e devo dire che questo webinar Arco si era proposto di analizzare questa situazione, lo scopo è quello di riunificare tutti gli sguardi che hanno coltivato questa disciplina, cioè la storia dell'arte antica, l'archeologia e poi la conoscenza empirica che viene dai singoli restauri. Tutto questo ha bisogno di essere rivisitato in maniera unitaria. E poi l'altra cosa importante è qual è il destino dell'insegnamento universitario. Questi sono insegnamenti di base ed è veramente un peccato, che parlo per la situazione italiana, che non sia previsto un insegnamento di questo genere. Mi fermo qua.
Well, I would like to profit the opportunity. I agree with the Professora Pallottino. It is surprising. There was no void. No, there was. These studies continued along the 20th century. Only they were ignored. They were ignored by the common interest, or maybe the organization of the universities, etc. But there were some people all around the world, I think, in Italy, in Germany, in Spain, in France, in England, in Netherlands. There were still people, architects, archaeologists, some amateurs, even maybe, you know. For example, it is curious that the best expert on medieval stereotomy, Werner Müller, he was a chemist. So he decided to change the field, and he contributed. He was the person who had contributed most since the 1960s to the field of medieval stereotomy. You know? So it is very relevant that this discipline didn't disappear completely, but it survived. No, maybe the word is it survived. It was ignored, but it survived. And now I think it is high time to recover the task of converting construction history in a discipline with at the same level of the history of architecture, of structural design, etc. It is it is, I think, a great anomaly that today we are in Spain, in Italy, in the School of Architecture and Engineering, we are giving titles to the students that habilitate them to make intervention in historic buildings, but they receive 0 credits on construction of these historic buildings or in structural theory of these historic buildings. This is a great anomaly. And the consequences of this anomaly are before our eyes. Many people really don't understand the construction of these old buildings, and it is, I think it is impossible to respect something which you do not understand. And the reverse, if you know something, it is much more difficult to do something bad. So I think knowledge, the quality associated to knowledge is respect. And what we see today very often is that the architects and engineers all over the world approach these buildings with a lack of respect, which is tremendous. No? It is, and I think it is our task, at least, to try to stop and revert this process. That maybe the new generations may have another background, another attitude better than ours. No? So I thank you for this comment. This has not disappeared. We are in some way rediscovering or continue this interest. And this is, from my point of view, our task.
Ci sono domande da parte di qualcuno che vuole intervenire? Fare un commento su...
Io vorrei fare una domanda al professore. Diciamo, sono stati visti molti titoli di opere in merito alla disciplina, e per una persona che comunque nei suoi studi precedenti non ha approfondito questi aspetti in maniera diciamo dettagliata, quale di queste consiglia per iniziare ad approcciarla?
Some advice. Well, it is a good question because as there are no departments, so as the discipline has not been organized still. This is a good question. Well, first, maybe to attend some of these congresses which are being held all around the world. Either, for example, it is yearly, or it was before the COVID yearly. There is a small conference in Cambridge. This international congress is every 3 years. In Spain is every 2 years. In France, I think it is every 3 years. So I think to go to a congress is a very good way to establish contact with people who are working or are interested at different levels in this discipline. I would like to say also that the atmosphere in these congresses is very stimulating. I mean, I have not seen the same atmosphere in other more established congresses. No. We all the participants, we all know that we are working in something which is new, and there is a great interchange between all the participants. So the Congress functions as it should be. A Congress is a meeting of people. No? This is the sense of the Congress, not to publish a paper and then to win points for whatever of these quality agencies, sinister, etc. No? The objective of a Congress is to go there and to speak with people and to participate, and so this is a good option. Another one is well, to read one of these classic books I have been speaking about. For example, this book by Straub, or for example the manual of Bill Addis, the 3,000 Years of Building. Well, this is maybe not a book to be read. It is more a handbook, no? A book for consulting, no? But even the book of Straub, which is 60 years old, it is a good book, and also to focus on one period. No, some people are fascinated by Gothic construction. For example, there is a lot of publications on Gothic construction, and one of the problems now is that as the discipline is not well organized, it is difficult to discern which is good and which is not. No, but this is the only ways to go into the publications and to read critically and to talk with the people who are establish contact with the people who are doing research in the different topics. This is so my advice is to go to attend one of the congresses and then to see what happens there.
Ok, va bene, la ringrazio molto dei suoi consigli datemi, davvero, molte grazie.
Grazie a te.
Se non ci sono altre domande, volevo fare una domanda anch'io a Santiago, la faccio in italiano. In che modo e quanto è importante combinare, diciamo, una conoscenza dei trattati, della trattatistica storica, degli studi sulla storia della costruzione con il lavoro sul campo, cioè con quello che uno vede e misura quando vede i monumenti, quando cammina sopra i monumenti, quando li tocca. Quanto, secondo te, Santiago, è importante combinare questi due aspetti proprio per la formazione di una persona che poi lavorerà nel campo dei monumenti?
Well, this is fundamental. Of course, fundamental to go to visit the buildings. If it is possible to go on top of the walls, so to visit these parts, which explains better the construction, this is not always easy. This is not always easy. Indeed, it is very difficult sometimes. But of course, to combine the reading of books with the observation and the actual study of the monuments, and also to read the books in a critical way. I mean, any book gives a theory or an interpretation, and we should be critical in the sense that we must question if what we have read, we agree with that or not, or we may observe other things, etc. The problem is that if the buildings are well preserved, the construction is hidden. No, it's hidden behind the plaster or the paintings, etc. No, so we can observe the general forms, the structure, the general geometry, which is important indeed. To go more deeper than that, then we need to obtain some kind of permission, and this is only possible in the context of some kind of course or congress. For example, in the congresses, we organize always visits to historic buildings and visiting places which are usually not accessible. No, to go on top of the walls, or to climb the towers, or inspect the cryptas or whatever. But you are right, Gianmarco. It is the reading and the studying of book must be complemented with the visit and the study of the real buildings. This is the only way. This is the only way. Thank you.
Non so se ci sono altre domande da parte...
Salve, buonasera. Avrei una domanda. I can do in English. I'm a student of PhD in Politecnico di Bari. I already participated a lesson with Professor Huerta in the Polytechnic University PhD courses as a scudo. But I'm interested in knowing if there is a book about the Madrileñan architecture in the 18th century, because it's my area of study. So I want to know if there is any book of this theme, because I saw a lot of books in your presentation from the 19th century and the 20th century. So I want to know.
Yes, well, I restricted my presentation to, so to say, secondary sources. I mean, books who are based on other books or on previous things. It is fundamental to, for example, if you are studying a particular period in a particular country, to read and to consult the architectural and construction manuals of the period. Sometimes they are not very informative, but some others are surprising. For example, in Spain, we have the case of the treatise of Fray Lorenzo San Nicolás. Fray Lorenzo San Nicolás was an architect from Madrid, and he published a book called Arte y Uso de Arquitectura, Art and Use of Architecture. Well, this is after Kugler. Kugler said that this was probably the best manual of architecture ever written. This was the opinion of Kugler, not mine. But I agree. I agree. It is impressive because there are two types of treatises. Most are compilations. They compile, they copy previous handbooks. In the case of Fray Lorenzo knew all the previous sources, of course, Vitruvius, Alberti, etc., Vignola, etc. But Fray Lorenzo wrote an original manual. The book had an enormous influence all over the centuries in Spain. A friend of mine, a historian, told me that already at the beginning of the 20th century, around 900, the builders used to bring the Fray Lorenzo to the building sites. The book by Fray Lorenzo, the first edition, is 1639. So almost 3 centuries after, the book was still in use, widely used. If you want to understand, for example, the construction of a parish church in Castilla after the 17th century, then you should better to study Fray Lorenzo, because some parish churches have been built with the Fray Lorenzo, using the Fray Lorenzo. Fray Lorenzo gives, for example, a complete set of structural rules for walls and buttresses, and he described it is, to my knowledge, of all the treatises which I know, it is the one who explained better the building of vaultings. So Fray Lorenzo explained the building of vaults of 3 materials: stone, brick with radial joints, and tile walls. So he describes the building of every type of this vault. So it is a very, very, very important manual. So if you are working, if you are working in Madrid in the 18th century, for example, if you are working in the construction of churches, know that in the Fray Lorenzo you will find a lot of information. And now this is in internet. In Spanish Society of the Construction History, we have a digital library with the most important Spanish manuals, so you can download it and go through Fray Lorenzo. Some other manuals are not so clear or so important, but in any case, to read these historic manuals, it is very, very important. Another manual who had enormous influence from the technical point of view is Alberti. Alberti has been studied mainly from the point of view, as Vitruvius, from the point of view of the orders, of the symmetry, of many, but maybe 30 or 40% of Alberti, the Rea Edificatoria, is technical. He speaks about again walls, arches, mortars, many. Alberti gives rules for towers. So it is always important to consult and to read the manuals of this period. So this will be one of my advice. And then, as we have all the proceedings of the Spanish Society in internet, in the web of the society, maybe going through the indexes, you may find some communications which are interesting to you or not. But but it is very important to, of course, to read the manuals of the 18th century, 70s and 18th century in Spain, which are not so many. Maybe important, maybe there are 10 or 20, so not so many.
Okay, thank you very much for this information, because they are very important for my study, because I'm focusing about the techniques of construction of palace and the relationship between the Spanish architecture, the building of a palace in Naples, and all in the south of Italy. So it's important for me to create a connection between Spain, Madrid, and Naples in that period.
Well, in the 18th century, Napoli was part of Spain, no?
Yes, that's it.
For sure. I have not studied this topic, but I will study Fray Lorenzo San Nicolas, Arte y Uso de Arquitectura, because
thank you very much.
I am sure that the Spanish architects who were working in Napoli then, they have the book, and probably the book is in the libraries of Napoli, no? Because this book had 3 or 4 editions, so it was maybe the most important Spanish treatise that of Fray Lorenzo.
I will find out if there is any copy in Napoli's library.
You have the PDF in internet. That's for sure, and it would be interesting to find if it is in the libraries. But I will bet that yes, it must be there.
Thank you very much.
Certo.
Ciao, buongiorno professor Huerta, sono Lorenzo Iurina, Politecnico di Milano. Molte grazie per questa quantità infinita di informazioni che ci ha dato. Viene voglia di leggerli tutti questi libri. Bene, una domanda che è legata non solo alla storia delle costruzioni, ma anche al modi per intervenire sulle costruzioni, consolidare le costruzioni, che è un po' uno dei nostri obiettivi in questo momento, obiettivi progettuali. Finalmente le strutture antiche si stanno riutilizzando e il rispetto è talmente importante che davvero costituisce uno dei parametri più importanti per l'intervento. La domanda che le faccio è: qualcuno dei libri, dei testi che lei ci ha mostrato, parla in modo esplicito degli errori che sono stati compiuti nel pensare le volte, nel realizzare le volte, e quindi errori che poi hanno portato a crolli naturalmente, legati a fatti fisici, a fatti di errore, diciamo, di concezione, o testi nei quali il quadro fessurativo, che è uno dei sintomi più importanti, venga illustrato in modo il più possibile dettagliato per poterci aiutare a fare diagnostica e quindi a progettare interventi risolutivi e rispettosi. La ringrazio e spero di averla muy pronto en unas otras ocasiones.
I hope so that we eventually, along this next year, we could meet somewhere after 2 years of isolation. Well, it is a pertinent question, no? The maintenance is our main obligation now. We should maintain these monuments which have survived after many centuries, sometimes millennia, and arrived to us. And we should preserve these monuments for the future generations. No? And then I would like to point one thing: these monuments have arrived to us being maintained. So any building who has a long life, it is because it has been maintained and repaired, and people took care, etc., replaced some stones or whatever. No, so this is one important thing. No, this is a historic fact. The traditional methods of maintenance, which were based in using the traditional materials, lime mortar, etc., should be still used. As for the quadro fissurativo, for the cracking, which is obvious in many buildings, then we have here a problem, no? which connects with the first part of my intervention. For any modern architect and engineer, a crack is a problem. A crack is always a problem. This is the prelude of a ruin, it causes alarm, etc. Well, cracks are not a problem. Cracks are natural in masonry and should be studied with distance and calm. The cracks signal the movements which the building had maybe centuries ago. Some of the cracks are historic, and maybe these cracks are, from the point of view of the stability, irrelevant. Only when the cracks are the evidence of recent movements and that these movements are in progress, so the cracks are alive, then in this case they deserve an attentive study. In my experience, almost 30 years or 30 years now, which I have been acting as consultant in many buildings, which I have discovered is that in most cases the cracks are irrelevant, and the problem is in the head of the architect or the engineer, who is afraid of the cracks because he cannot understand, he cannot accept that the very nature of masonry is that masonry cracks and deforms and adapt. And this is the main problem. When the architect or the engineer wants to close the cracks and to impede the building cracking, then he's acting against the very nature of the building. And it is a lost battle. I mean, when a building who weighs maybe, I don't know, 5,000 tons, 10,000 tons moves, who is going to impede the movement of this building? You can put, for example, a reinforced concrete beam or whatever, no? If the building wants to move, it will move and it will break this concrete beam, and the beam, before breaking, will destroy part of the masonry. I was fortunate at the beginning of my studies. I remember very well a conference, a lecture delivered by Mario Piana in the Architectural Association in Madrid. I can tell the year also, 1985, so many years ago. And Mario Piana explained very, very clearly the problem in Venice, in Venezia, no? That in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, they tried to avoid the movement of the walls, etc. No? This is the wrong approach, and this approach is based on distrust and ignorance. So, of course, when there is a pattern of cracks, they could be studied. Most times they are irrelevant, and only if the cracks are alive and there is a consistent evidence that the cracks are growing, then maybe some action should be taken. But in my experience of 30 years, I have not seen the case. So, because logically, if a building is maybe 500 years old, you give me the velocity of the crack, and I multiply by 500, no? And then what? So this is the main problem is to accept that masonry cracks and deform, and the cracks are not bad. Indeed, the cracks are good. I mean, we have seen for example, recently after the earthquake of 2017 in Mexico, there was before the COVID, there was in 2019 a congress, and we visit many buildings who suffered the earthquakes, etc. And in many cases, the major source of damage was the previous insertion of reinforced concrete beams and frames. this was the main source of damage. The second was the abandonment, the lack of maintenance. If you have masonry, a good masonry with lime mortar, etc., and you abandon this masonry and let the entry of water for, I don't know, 50, 100 years, then lime mortar dissolve, and then you do not have a wall, you have a set of stones which of course, even without the earthquake, will collapse. No? So I don't know if I have answered your question. I
sure, thank you so much.
The necessity of taking another approach, not to get alarmed so easily. No? I have very briefly. I have put in the 2D one of the aqueduct of Segovia. No? The aqueduct of Segovia is almost 2,000 years old. It was built by Trajan, and suddenly in the 1990s, some people said and believed that it was collapsing. Well, really? You go to Segovia and you have a look at this wonderful work of engineering. So what is the problem? And the same, but it is a long story, but it is a great evidence that the problem many times is not in the cracks, but in the valorization of the cracks. If you consider that cracks are dangerous and are the prelude of the ruin, then you will find that most, if not all, the monuments need to be stitched and etc. No, and it is not the case. No?
Thank you so much for the answer.
Oh, thank you for the question.
Grazie. Allora, se non ci sono altre domande, chiederei a Elisabetta Pallottino di fare un ultimo saluto e ci aggiorniamo e aggiornarci alla prossima conferenza, al prossimo webinar dell'Arco. Grazie Elisabetta, grazie al professor Huerta ancora anche per la sua disponibilità, aver risposto a tutte le domande. Grazie mille.
Grazie a te Gianmarco, ovviamente grazie a Huerta, è stata una conferenza veramente di grandissimo interesse, molto vicina a quelle che erano le nostre intenzioni nel momento in cui abbiamo promosso questo webinar, per i motivi che sono stati detti anche negli interventi. Io ringrazio anche le 57 persone che a un certo punto ci stavano ascoltando, e a questo proposito vorrei dire che, poi lascio la parola a Giulia Brunori, vorrei dire che se volete mandare il vostro indirizzo mail, noi possiamo avvisarvi, perché la comunicazione di questo webinar è ovviamente destinata per prima cosa ai soci dell'Arco, poi a varie università, è stata mandata alla SIRA, l'Associazione del Restauro. Oggi Gianmarco ha sicuramente contattato moltissime persone, e quindi se voi lasciate a Giulia Brunori, che adesso vi dà l'indirizzo dell'Arco, il vostro indirizzo, potrete essere avvisati anche per le altre conferenze, perché quella di oggi è la seconda di un webinar che ci accompagnerà fino ad aprile del 2022. Grazie molte a Huerta e a tutti.